Welcome to the Philosophy of Horror podcast, a podcast where we discuss philosophical topics as they relate to horror stories. My name is D.H. Hyde. I am an artist, a horror fan, and I'm actually writing a horror novel right now that I'll start querying shortly. And who are you, Joshua?
My name is Joshua Howard. I am a philosopher by schooling and a hypnotist by trade. I work mostly with people with fears, particularly fear around public speaking, and you can find me at perpetualpresence.com.
Okay, great. So, this is the first episode of the Philosophy of Horror podcast. Our ideas on a philosophy of horror podcast is to revolve a number of episodes around a book called The Philosophy of Horror by analytic philosopher Noel Carroll. We will discuss Carroll's philosophy of horror and hopefully answer the question of do his ideas hold up today in 2026? In addition, we're going to do some one-off episodes where we do deep dives on specific horror movies, books, or franchises, and really discuss some of the philosophic ideas in those stories. I started thinking about Carol when I was writing my most recent book, when I started just kind of brainstorming, outlining, and like starting the first draft of my most recent book. And I remembered a presentation that I saw you do at a university where you talked about Carol and the philosophy of horror and what makes it horror. And, I had this idea for a book and I started writing it, and it occurred to me that this could potentially be a horror story. And so I started thinking about some of your work, academic work in the philosophy of horror, and I was just like, okay, so let's go back to Noel Carroll's philosophy of horror. What makes it a horror story? And then I started brainstorming like how the plot would have to, with the direction that it would have to go in order to be a horror story, and decided that that actually made a lot of sense for the characters. And I was like, oh, okay, great. I'm writing a horror novel, which I've never done before. I've always been a fan of horror movies. I love Stephen King. Um, I like H.P. Lovecraft, but I had never really thought of myself as a horror writer until I started writing this book. And, so at that point, I was like, Carol, man, like, let's get into it. And, we've been trying to collaborate on something for a while, like some type of academic project. And, like here we are. And so I think as we go through these episodes, not only are we going to be kind of discussing Carol and like grappling with these questions of what is horror, what isn't horror, what type of philosophical questions are answered by horror stories specifically. While we're doing that, I'm also going to be kind of experiencing this in my writing of this book, and now that I'm going through revisions and like getting my manuscript ready to query, like I'm really starting to dig into some of those tropes and like seeing those in the book and be like, oh, okay, well, here's the beginning of a common horror trope. Like, let's kind of flesh it out and go forward. And so, I'm thinking about a lot of this like in real time in my own work. So, Josh, I guess to start things off, who's Noel Carroll and why should we care?
Noel Carroll is an American philosopher who mostly does philosophy of aesthetics, which is to say philosophy of art. And he's written several influential books, but the most influential for what we're talking about would be a book called The Philosophy of Horror that he wrote in 1990. And the reason that we should care is because it's basically the most influential horror, like philosophy of horror book of all time. It's not the only theory. It's starting to lose its grip in a lot of ways because there are a lot of other ways of looking at things at the current moment. But since 1990 until very recently, it was probably the most talked about, if not the only thing that was really talked about by quite a lot of philosophers on aesthetics, particularly analytic philosophers, because the other major school was psychoanalysis, which has a tendency to run in continental circles and be like very convoluted and confusing, and something a lot of analytic philosophers don't particularly grasp on.
Analytic philosophers don't care about the subjective human experience. That's my Kanye West impression.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're pretty accurate. You're pretty accurate on that though, because that's something we're going to get into. But one of Carroll's issues with trying to create a philosophy of horror is that people want to watch these movies or read these books in order to be scared, but it's hard to quantify what specifically scares one person versus another person, right? And so that ends up being one of the issues that we get into. But I don't want to get too far ahead of myself here. So.
So, Josh, why is Carol interested in writing about horror stories?
Well, Carol has lots of reasons for being interested in horror, but I think the major one is that a lot of people weren't taking it super seriously and were thinking of it as something that wasn't very artistic. And at the same time, there were lots of people who were really into it as an artistic movement, and then saying to themselves, "Why are people interested in this?" And I think both sides in aesthetics were really looking at this question: Why do people even like these movies? And so Carol starts kind of with that question: what is it that causes people to want to be art horrified, right? Because, like, in general, if you tell somebody, hey, I'm going to make you sit down for 2 hours, I'm going to make you feel really terrible, I'm going to pump you full of adrenaline, and I'm going to make an experience that you're probably going to leave feeling bad from. Why in the hell would you want to do that? Right. And that's kind of this question that people in genre studies had, is like, why do people even want this, what is objectively a horrible experience, right? Because, like, nobody wants the experiences that happen to a character in a horror film to happen to them in real life. Like, I mean,
Yeah.
I'm sure you can find like two people, but like not many people would be interested in that. I don't want to go, let's not go with all, but let's go with like a lot, a lot of
Yeah,
some people.
most people don't want to be turned into a human centipede. Got it.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, there's always those weird people that want to be like eaten or something, but that's a
Yeah,
whole,
yeah.
other
Sure.
discussion. But
Sure.
for the most part, like, if you were trying to be horrified, if you were being horrified in real life, you'd be having a bad time. And so everybody's going to themselves like, why are people interested in these? And if people are interested in them, what's sort of the structure of them that we can look at so we can understand why people enjoy the experience of being scared? And I think personally for me that question comes out of a lot of like elitism, because like nobody questions like, well, why would you want to watch a tragedy that makes you feel like shit? Like, why would you want to go watch like
Yeah.
Shakespeare and you're gonna feel fucking terrible at the end of it?
Yeah.
Nobody questions that. Everybody's like, oh yeah, Shakespeare's art. But when it comes to horror films, people have a lot of this like thought. And I think personally, just from having been an academic and having lots of conversations about this, and this is me putting this on him, but I think probably what was going on for him is like, hey, I actually kind of like these movies. Why is everybody in academia such a dick about it? That would be my assumption. I'm putting thoughts on him, but that's what I would assume. So coming from that, really, he starts trying to ask this from an analytic perspective, which is to say, a perspective very interested in like objective facts. What's like the things that we can look at, and kind of divorcing ourselves from subjective experience altogether and looking almost completely from I'll put it in quotes, objective position. Like, what can we say, like, is a horror film if it was an artifact that was like a thing that we could talk about? That's kind of what we're looking at. And so in order to answer a question like that, you end up with definitions, and there's this thing and this part, and it works this way. And if it doesn't work that way, then it's not. Uh, which inevitably ends up being a problem with horror genre studies as we go through time. But Carroll's model wants to do that, quantify what specific elements make it a horror film. And I know that seems nitpicky to a lot of people that don't do philosophy, so bear with me here, but because we'll get further into what specifically he's talking about, and then I think once you can see that, you can kind of argue about it a little bit.
So, Josh, my understanding of the philosophy of horror by Carroll is that he really wants to focus on this idea of a monster, and that horror stories center around a monster. He has a criteria for what makes it a monster, and that the juxtaposition is that there is a main character who a monster shows up in their lives, they're confronted with it, they don't necessarily want to be confronted by it, but they are, and then they have to somehow survive. And he talks a lot about that, and then he goes into the question of like, why do people like horror movies, and he has some ideas on that. Most notably, one is that he says that, people enjoy being scared in a safe environment. Like you can watch a horror movie, you can experience like the fear of the main character from the safety of a movie theater or your own home, knowing that the horrific things aren't actually going to happen to you.
Mhm.
Um, so, what else is going on in this book?
So there's a couple other things that are going on here. The major one would be that he's really interested in not talking about qualia, which is to say
Mhm.
subjective experience, right? So qualia is like, how it feels when you touch your hand or how specifically that looks to you or subjective crap. And so he doesn't want to talk about anything like that. And so he says, how can we make an objective standard where we can talk about some sort of objective, like structural movement in the story that we can follow the horrific emotion. And so the major place that he relies on to do this is the main character. And so if the main character is feeling something, then we can say that that's the emotion of the story because there's one main character that gives us one emotion that gives us one story to be talking about. And so he wants to get rid of qualia altogether. The other thing that I would say is he has a historical perspective that he adds to it. And he says that horror evolves out of Gothic literature. And so it starts really with like Mary Shelley writing Frankenstein and Edgar Allan Poe and Bram Stoker with Dracula and those kind of books really start pushing the Gothic genre up. And then as the Gothic genre starts to expand, one of the ways it expands is into horror. And
Right.
so I think those are the other two elements that are missing. But yeah, the narrative of a horror film and what makes a horror film is that there's a main character who has to deal with a monster who is like terrifying in a lot of different ways and threatening and has to overcome that. And us watching that movement is what the horror film is, or the horror book, or whatever, the horror
Sure.
narrative.
We're going to keep coming back to Carol as we do the first several episodes of this podcast. Carol is doing genre studies and trying to define horror as a genre, which is fascinating. I don't think it's the most fascinating thing about horror movies or stories, but it is worth talking about in a podcast about the philosophy of horror. So we're going to do a good number of episodes where we talk about Carroll, what he says horror is, and whether or not we agree, and then contrast that with some psychoanalysts and other philosophers who have attempted to define horror. But in addition to that, we're going to talk about some philosophic ideas that, while maybe not unique to horror, are definitely more pronounced in horror. My personal fascination with horror stories is that they have this existential element where they usually revolve around a character who is forced to confront death in a very real and unexpected way. I think the quintessential story would be slashers, where you have someone who is in a situation they didn't intend to get into, and all of a sudden their friends are dying, and now they have to confront not only their own mortality, but also the loss and death of those who are close to them, and they have to do it in this very like dramatic and often grotesque way. Carol doesn't really go into that, but I think that that's a good example of the type of things that we'll talk about as we go throughout this series. So, I mean, another idea we had was that, in addition to talking about Carol and the philosophy of horror, we'll also do episodes where there are kind of one-offs. We might talk about the philosophy of The Shining, for example, and just do a deep dive. What kind of philosophic ideas are in the story? Why are they important? Does the author do a good job of conveying those? And, we'll also touch on the difference between uh, a more analytic perspective on genre studies and the subjective experience of the viewer. Because Carroll, as an analytic philosopher, I think sees the audience experience as not necessarily irrelevant, but impossible to quantify. And so, because you can quantify the audience experience, then it's something that maybe you shouldn't be writing about as a philosopher. I vehemently disagree with that. But then again, Carroll has good reasons for going there in his book, The Philosophy of Horror. And so we're going to spend a lot of time talking about subjectivity, the author's intent, how those tie into each other, and what makes a horror movie good. Because I would argue that if no one likes it, it's not good. That being said, the other thing that we would want to talk about, I guess, to contrast Carroll's analytic work is the psychoanalytic approach to genre studies and horror specifically. So, can you just briefly explain what psychoanalysis brings to um, horror studies, I guess we would want to say?
Yeah, and but before I do that though, I would mention there's also another school called the socio-historical perspective.
Sure. Right, right, right.
That one's worth talking about as well. But I have a tendency to just bleed that into everything that I do because I do post-structural philosophy, so that's kind of just like the way that I think in general. So if I'm talking about stuff, I'm gonna be thinking, oh, it's from this time period, it does this, and it has this perspective. And the psychoanalytic school does that a lot as well. And in order to really understand higher level philosophy of horror, you really need to understand these three schools like together so that you can kind of see like why people are going in the places they are. Because if you just jump into kind of contemporary genre studies, you might want to collapse back into these previous
Mm,
ones without knowing
hmm.
why they're doing what they're doing.
Yeah.
But anyway, all that academic blah 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 aside, the psychoanalytic school is like actually very simple. They say that the reason you would be interested in horror films is because they're access to like nightmares, which is like a
Hmm,
connection to a type
hmm.
of dream, right? And
Yeah.
so they're a nightmare, which is a dream, which is a way that they use to read subconscious cues and or unconscious cues, depending on which psychoanalytic you're talking about. But we'll say unconscious just to make it simple. So they're able to read unconscious cues from the symbols of the dream, and in the same way, a horror film is going to have certain symbols. So there's always going to be some kind of scary thing in it, and that scary thing could either be a representation of something you're afraid of or something you're afraid of being, right? So either it's like the Janus face, like two-sided mask. Janus is a Greek god that had two faces,
Right.
for
Yeah,
those
yeah,
that
yeah,
don't
yeah,
know.
yeah. Yeah.
And so it's either like about this two-sidedness to yourself, like you're afraid of being something that you're not, like Jekyll and Hyde, or you're legitimately afraid of something that can hurt you out in the real world. And they're really interested in the ways that, particularly the Janus face position, is about oppression and repression. And so there are sides of yourself that you don't show because you don't want to be oppressed, and so you're also repressing yourself. And so they're really interested in how all that works out.
Right. And then the socio-historical perspective is that mostly has to do with comments on society, right? That
Yeah, I mean, yeah, go ahead.
that that what the story is really doing is like keying in on elements of the like current like cultural moment, right?
Yeah, essentially that's what socio-historical stuff in philosophy is for the most part. It's kind
Hmm.
of like really 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 watered down Foucauldianism. As,
Gotcha.
I mean,
Okay.
I don't want to poo-poo it because it's kind of its own school, but it's essentially kind of like the same sort of analytic that like Foucault would do, but with like way less variables. And so, yeah, they're really interested in like this is happening at this time period, which is leading people to think in a certain way. And for me, just given the way that I think, I'm going to look at both Carroll's model and the psychoanalytics through that kind of lens, right? And so,
Sure.
like, if we're talking about like the psychoanalytic school, and we're saying, okay, so like slasher movies, if we're
Yeah, I
talking
was
about
gonna say
slasher
that's
movies, they're
yeah, that's the first thing that comes to mind for me when if because all three perspectives are relevant and fascinating. And I mean, we'll probably do an episode just on slashers in the future.
yeah,
But yeah, that's immediately what I thought because there's definitely this socio-historical element to it, but there's also a lot of psychoanalytic interpretations. And of course, Carol, right? Because it's a monster. You have, Michael Myers or the Slumber Party Massacre dude, running around killing people.
yeah, exactly. And the thing is for me the socio-historical perspective, again, it seems to be like the bedrock foundation of talking about either one, because
Hmm.
this is why movies end up being dated and feel really dated after a
Yeah.
while, is because you look back on it and you don't have the same societal fears and their things aren't really as scary in a way as they were in a different time period. Like one of the things about slasher films that's interesting is that they focus so heavily on this fear of the collapse of the nuclear family. And that was something that was very, very big between like 1960 and like 1985. But once you hit like the mid 80s, people aren't really as afraid of that because people have been getting divorces for like 30 years at that, like 20, 30 years at that
Oh
point.
yeah. Well, and now, I mean, with the way technology is, like a slasher, a classic slasher is like impossible. It's like the killer shows up, you like hit SOS on your smartphone, you and all your friends do, and the police are there in like 30 seconds and they kill the dude in the street. I mean, you know what I mean? Like
Well, yeah,
that's what
and
happens in 2026.
they have to make them differently now. Like there are slasher
Yeah,
movies that have come out now. I mean, a lot of them are like continuations of stuff. But one I would
sure.
point out to people if they haven't seen is called "It's a Wonderful Knife," which is
Oh yeah, yeah,
about
yeah.
it's about this the mayor of the city who's a serial killer.
Mhm.
And this girl stops him from killing people, including her brother, and ends up killing him. But then she's like hated by the city that she lives in, and it makes her really suicidal. So she makes this wish that she'd never been born at all. And so
Right.
then she wakes up the next day, like in the city, if she had never been there. And the city is a nightmare because the mayor of the city is a serial killer who just like kills off all of his
Yeah,
competition. So he's like buying
yeah.
up all of the city, and then she has to figure out a way to like get around it. But again, that's like a slasher plus this, excuse me, really like metaphysical kind of premise.
Right.
Sorry.
Right.
And
Well, and
so,
also and also the take on It's a Wonderful Knife. I mean, It's a Wonderful Life. I mean, it's in the title for Christ's sake. So
yeah, yeah, and I mean, that's what I mean by the mystical element of it is like, she gets to relive this
yeah,
experience that she wouldn't have had otherwise. But,
sure.
but I think the thing is that like, if you're talking about a slasher movie now, it has to very much be like one killer killing one person who they can get a jump on, like the idea that
Hmm.
there's like a killer at like a serial killer at like a party in the woods, like in the first Scream movie. It's like that couldn't
Yeah.
happen in 2026. Like you could
No,
write a slasher
there's too much
movie. You could
surveillance.
you could write one in like 1985 or like even like
Right.
2001. Like you could write like a historical piece that goes back that time period. But I still think like most of the things about a slasher film that were interesting are really interesting because of the 1970s thing, even like with the final
Yeah,
girl
yeah,
and
yeah.
stuff like that. And I
Oh,
know like
sure.
we're gonna end up talking about this later on, so I don't want to delve into it too much. But
Sure. Well, and also the thing with a lot of contemporary movies is that they are an homage to something from the past.
mhm.
So, It's a Wonderful Knife is a good example. But there are a good amount of horror movies that have come out in the 2020s that are actually an homage to, earlier horror movies. And so, in that sense, the his socio-historical perspective is not, it's not that they're necessarily commenting on society now as much as they're paying tribute to the greats of the past.
Yeah, though I mean I think the socio-historical people would say to you like yes, but they have to do it in a 2026 way that
Sure.
comments on something
Yeah.
now, because if they
Okay.
just made like a full tilt homage to the movie in the style that it was, people wouldn't really like it. um
Sure. Sure. Sure.
and
Sure.
I think you noticed that like because both you and I like different bands and different metal genres. I think both of us have noticed this. Like if you do an older cover, you have to like update it to the sound. You're not just
Right.
gonna like do a cover that sounds exactly like it did in the past, because if you do, people are gonna be like, this sounds all dated and stuff. And so the what the socio-historical people are interested in is not even necessarily like they're interested in the story and the beats of it, but they're really interested in like the theme and what it's talking about and how it relates back to people in that time period. And this is why for me I have a hard time separating it from psychoanalysis, because I don't think you can do a good psychoanalytic reading without jamming that in there. So like you have to do both at the same time.
Sure.
So that's usually the way I think about it, is like inside of a psychoanalytic model.
Gotcha. Kind of like Graveyard Classics by 6 Feet Under. The music sounds exactly like AC/DC, but Chris Barnes is the vocalist. So it's
Yeah.
different.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and I mean that's like a genre update. Well, and the thing too is like when that album came out, like ACDC was still like, oh, it's like a whole thing. But it's like you listen to ACDC in the grocery store now. It's like
That's
you listen to
true.
like Metallica in the grocery store now. And so it's like, I don't know, like metal bands now they have more of like, they have a tendency to have like a gent kind of vibe to them. They have a tendency to have like a lot heavier vocals. And they have a tendency to like, if they're going to have some sort of singing, it's going to be like really poppy and melodic and not like, classic rock vibes. It's going to be like, some like pop singer chick. That seems to be
Well,
really really popular with a lot of the like newer metal bands.
I mean, I for one would like to hear graveyard classics in the grocery store. I'd specifically like to hear Chris Barnes in the adult diaper aisle. It would be very apropos.
Yeah, I mean,
So, moving
as
on.
I'm just saying though, as I'm getting older, I feel gypped that like I can listen to a lot of bands from the '90s and classic rock, but Cannibal Corpse is not playing in the like grocery store. It should be like, it should be. I mean, especially at a place that sells literal corpses, like they sell like meat.
Yeah, the fuck.
It's like, how is Cannibal Corpse too offensive, and you like sell corpses in this store?
Yeah.
It's craziness.
Or that like the avant-garde punk band, the Meatmen. Play
Yeah,
that shit in the grocery store, man. Come on now.
yeah. Why does it got to be Mariah Carey and Metallica?
I'm saying, man, I went to this sex shop. They weren't even playing I'm Gonna Fuck Myself by Gigi Allen. I was like, bro, it's the whole reason I'm here.
Yeah, because I'm the best.
Yeah. Duh. So, to sum things up, this is our first episode. Next time we're going to talk about Noel Carroll's idea of a monster. And we're going to answer this question, what is a monster? What does Carroll think about it? And why do we give a shit? As a horror fan, I would say I definitely give a shit about monsters. They're cool, but they also serve another important role in the horror genre. We will talk about that next time. So join us, like and subscribe. If you do like what we're doing here, tell your friends about us. If you absolutely hated what we're doing here and you're like, this is the most horrible piece of shit I've ever seen, then tell your enemies about us. And that will conclude the inaugural episode of the Philosophy of Horror podcast. Stay spooky.